He thought that God had not written on the subject, and since he hadn't written on the subject, there was no answer. But the problem is, we got to look and read and study and find out. And this discourse that we're going to read about is one of tremendous interest to most of us because it answers some questions that we didn't think that there were answers to. The reason being, we went to the wrong place. There came a time in the life of Brother Job that he began to question the Almighty. And when he was questioning the Almighty, it wasn't that he wasn't allowed to do the questioning. It's just that he had to meet a certain premise, station, circumstance for him to be able to approach to ask these questions. God had given Job something that Job didn't understand, and therefore Job had questioned the wisdom of God. Because Job reasoned like we reason. If I'm a servant of God, if I've done His will, if I've been faithful to His commands, why am I like I am? There's a lot of people that answer that question when it comes time to die, or when they have physical maladies that they don't understand as to why they have them, why there's pain and agony and torture to the person who's a faithful child of God, and the other people who are not faithful, there is no such. So the Almighty answers Job and rebukes him in his answer and his friends. And this rebuke comes in 4 chapters that we'll be studying for a period of time, because I want you to be able to at least handle yourself when this might come to you. It's broken into 2 parts, and the 2 parts are Job's confession and trying to get God to stop the answers that he's given. These are closely connected and form a single appeal to God because of Job's profound ignorance of God's government. We start off with God's natural government, which is creation. And because Job couldn't understand the natural government of God, God didn't see that it was worthwhile, if he couldn't understand that, why God would go to his moral government. And not being able to advance to the moral government, there would be no reason that God would answer the question as to why the Church of Christ would have ever come into existence. This single appeal to God, because of Job's profound ignorance of God's natural law, which incapacitated him from passing judgment on what was so far incomprehensible and mysterious to Job, God didn't take kindly to. Because what Job was doing was questioning God. And there's some things that God established that shouldn't be questioned. But I want to take you for a few minutes and go through the 10 verses of Job 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, now you notice it was out of the whirlwind. If you'll look at the whirlwind, you'll see that this is that which God answered Elijah when he had run and didn't understand what was going on. Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, and I'll demand of thee. And when you get ready and you are capable of conversation on this level, I will answer you. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare it, thou, if you have understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy, where were you? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as if it had been issued out of the womb? When I make the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and break upon it my decreed place, and set bars and doors, and said, hitherto thou shalt come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the day spring to know his place? You see, there were some things that God required. You just don't walk into the presence of God and make a demand for information. There were things that Job could not and did not know. And because he could not and did not know these things, the questioning of God and as to why Job was in his pain and misery and agony, why he was the greatest man on the earth at the time, greater than Abraham, Job didn't have a right to know. God said, why, the very audacity of you having the unmitigated gall to come into my presence and ask me questions that you don't have the right to answer. The creation of the material world, Job, were you there when I created that? The control and government of the sea, Job, can you explain that to me? The bringing forth of Orion, Job, tell me what that was and how that came about. The formation of Sheol, Job, of light and darkness, of snow and hail and floods and rain and lightning and thunder and ice. Explain these things to me, Job. We got to get on the same level before we can discuss something of such high priority. And the Bible says in Job 39, if you'll look, verses 1 through 30, but in these things we find answers to some questions that we might have never known the answers to unless these things had been discussed. Look at verse 30 of Job 39. The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, when he's going to reproduce? Or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the dominion thereof in the earth? Canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of water may cover thee? Command it to rain, Job. I'm sitting back watching. Canst thou send lightnings, that they may go, and say unto thee, here we are, what is thy demand? Who hath put wisdom in the inward parts? Or who hath given understanding to the heart? Who can number the clouds and has the wisdom to do so? Or who can say to the bottles of heaven, when the dust groweth into hardness, and the clods cleave fast together, wilt thou hunt the prey for the lion, or fill the appetite of the young lions? when they couch in their dens and abide in the covert or hidden places to lie in wait. Were you the one that came up with that plan, Job? Let's discuss that and see if that is the best thing for you to understand. Who provided for the raven his food when his young ones cry unto God? And are they going to wonder to you for the lack of meat? And we can just keep going and we will, if you'll come and join me in this study, because what I want to do is answer some questions you've had that I have sometimes hurriedly gone over that we're going to take the time and look at. Verse 2, chapter 38. Job had not been found faultless. He was not perfect. He had spoken many words without knowledge, or had insufficient knowledge, which bordered on lack of reverence. Job, what is this darkened counsel that you have? Who did you counsel with something that you didn't understand, but you guessed at and figured that you could come up with the answers? Have you given the enemies of God occasion with insufficient knowledge to bring blasphemy on my name? Do you realize, Job, the position or the place that you're in by questioning my wisdom? Do you comprehend who it is you're asking? This darkened counsel, casting doubts upon the ways of God. If I was Job, God speaking, I just don't believe I would have done that. Now, if you want to go back to some of this darkened counsel, you can go back to Job, the 21st chapter, the 7th through the 26th verse. And you'll see Job was like a lot of people that I work in my business. You put them in a position, and all of a sudden they have more wisdom and more understanding of something they don't understand at all than you can imagine. And they don't keep their mouths shut. They don't wonder at their ignorance and say, I don't know how to do this. They show their ignorance by the fact that they run their mouth and can't get the job done. This darkened counsel, Job, you cast doubts upon the way of God. You cast doubts upon the fact that God is merciful and has loving kindness. And you've almost indicted God for his justice by speaking as you've spoken. This makes Job open to censure and to receive condemnation. And so for that, Job cries out in the 40th chapter in the 4th verse, I'm vile. I'm guilty. But that which caused Job to come to this conclusion is something that we have to look at and be careful not to do the same thing. So the peace between Job and God had been broken, and reconciliation by God was demanded. And this time, God was not going to take the hit or the lick. Job had put himself in a questioning position before the Ancient of Days. And the first thing that the Ancient of Days requires of Job is that, Job, if you know a lot of things, then I will discuss them with you. But if you don't, why do you think I will take my time to discuss something with you that you're incapable of comprehending and that you have no way to understand by the very fact of, number one, in the creation, Job? Were you there in the creation? Well, Job wasn't a man that was that old. Because of the time that Job existed, the world had been existent for about 2,500 years. Now, Job might have been an old man, but he wasn't 2,500 years old. He said, Job, when I laid the foundations of the earth, tell me how I did it. Explain to me what I did. Well, now we often think and always say that God created the heavens and the earth in a moment and twinkling of an eye. That is true. But that doesn't forbear the fact that God had a way, that there was a plan, that there were rules of mathematics and engineering that are so astounding that people who could not comprehend what these are and revel, that is rejoice, in the brilliance that God showed, could never be able to comprehend these that he would discuss. It's like a man who has never done a function or a job being able to discuss with a master of a trade the work that he's doing and never ever begin to comprehend where the job began and what it was to get started. Job, verse 4, declare, if you will, these things in understanding. Or Job, I've got another question for you. Were you there when I laid the measures thereof? That is the measures of the earth. Do you know how I did this? Do you understand how I've stretched the line upon it? Now, I guess in our minds, we a lot of times think that God just did these things without understanding and comprehension. But stretching the line is something that's very interesting. Job, were you present? Did you see the genius of what I brought about? Did you witness it, Job? Not being able to do either does not cause you to be able to ask me how. Maybe we don't know what the line is. But if we go back to Genesis, I believe it is the first chapter and the 19th verse, God tells us. And when he tells us, we may be astounded because it brings on a whole lot more discussion like it did with Job than maybe what we're willing and ready to discuss. Let's look at Genesis 1:19 and see if that's odd. Yeah. And the evening and the morning were the first day. How did God determine to divide the light from darkness? How did God determine to separate the waters that brought forth abundantly the moving creatures that had life and the fowl that flew above the earth and the open firmament with the earth itself? You ever done any building? You ever laid a foundation? You ever been in a situation where you have to build something on sand? Do you know how you have to work pretty hard? Because sand is not too stable an item. When I first came to Florida, I'd not been used to building on the sand. We had something almost as hard as rock that we could build on where I'm from. And you could go into the rock and have some stableness and surety. But what about coming to a place like Florida where the only place that you can build on is something that has no stability or stableness? Now you think that's bad. Play Job. I divided the waters from the earth. Job. The earth was composed of sand and soil. Since sand and soil are nothing that I can help you to understand in consistency, I just need to ask you a question. How did I stop the water from coming beyond that point with no foundation? Or, as God calls it, no line. Now, this is not a line in the sand. This is a place of departure when the water would stop. How did I do that, Job? Was Job with God when he laid the foundations of the earth? Or was he present? Or did he witness it? Not being able to do either, would he know anything concerning it? But there were those beings who were present. And it gives us a remarkable understanding of how that there were witnesses to the creation of God that we may not have known existed. As God offered to grant Job's request, he bid him to stand forth as a man and gird himself for the contest. Because God demands of him, and because he has challenged God, Job must answer the questions asked him of God before he will give him the answers. If we were as Job and the foundations were laid, who would we go to question or to be witnesses of what God had done? You back in the 38th chapter? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Who are these morning stars? The angels of God. The angels of God were in existence at the creation of the earth. Turn over with me to a passage that a lot of times no one looks at in this manner, in the book of Revelation, the 5th chapter. And let's read about these sons of God and then shouting for joy of the creation that God has done. In verse 10 he says, "And thou hast made unto us our God, kings and priests, and we'll reign on the earth. And I beheld, and I heard the voice of many angels round about the throne, and the beast and the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom, strength, honor, and glory, and blessing. Every creature which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth, and such as are in the sea, and all that are in them, heard I say, Blessing and honor, glory and power be unto him that sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb forever and ever. And they bowed down and worshipped him that liveth forever." The angels that are existent here in Revelation 5 were the angels in heaven. That just goes to show you that they were in existence at the creation of the earth and saw God, Christ, work in the foundation of that work. And they sang. Now, usually when you sing, you do something because of joy and exhilaration. Let me give you another example, or for instance, on this. These are the angels in heaven that sang. When did the angels from the heavens of our earth sing? When God did something just as miraculously wonderful as it would be the creations of the earth. When a woman gave birth to a child that had never known a man. You remember that the angels in heaven sang in glory and exaltation and honor. Because of a God who could do something, oh no, he didn't stop to discuss it with us, but he told in prophecy how it would be done. At the very beginning of time, he said that a woman who knew not a man would bring forth a man-child who would destroy the works of the devil and his power. And when the angels of God sang praises for the great work that God had done, they were thanking or singing praises to a God who could do and create things by a power and a majesty and a wonder. Well, the report was, how can a woman have a child who knows not a man? How can a woman who has never had sexual expression from a male bring forth a child anyway? You just don't do these things. It just can't be done. But the angels were singing glory to God in the highest, peace on earth and goodwill toward men. For unto us is born this day in the city of Bethlehem a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. Do you realize what they were singing? Do you understand and comprehend? It's an expression of the same glory and majesty that occurred when, I'll go back and read it to you again, the morning stars. Now somebody will say this is the star of creation. I don't know that they sing, but I know that the angels sing. I've never heard an angel's voice. I imagine it is something beyond beauty. But when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God, which were they who were created to serve God in that celestial palace that existed before the terrestrial came into being, which is the earth, sang and shouted praises for joy. Or Job, who has shut up the sea with doors? Now stop and think about it. You got the tide rolling in. Have you ever looked at the doors at the sea? You know what they are? Sand. Job, you want to explain to me how I created a sea that is so magnificent and so powerful and so beyond the comprehension of man, and I determined it to have a line in the sand, a place that it cannot go further, that it must stop and retire. Job, explain to me how that I took something that cannot be and brought about something that is. Or he expresses it this way: I shut the sea up with doors when it broke forth, as if it had issued out of the womb. I kind of get the idea. When it's time for a child to be born, that child's coming from that womb. And you won't stop it. We've had 4 children. And of those children that came forth when it was a time for them to be born, there was nothing that we could do to hold it off or to hold it up or to cause it not to happen. And you know, Solomon came along before we ever had knowledge to understand and said, there's a time to live. There's a time to die. There's a time to be born. All of these things God has set in time. And as this time comes about, this is when God has determined that the sea is shut off from the land. He said, when I made the cloud, the garment thereof, or the garment of the earth, and thick darkness, a swaddling, or a covering, or like a diaper for it, when I brought about the heavens above the earth, for the earth to protect it from everything else that I created. Job, were you there? And when I break up for it my decreed place, or when I decide that the waters can overflow the earth, and I can set bars and doors where I want to. Let me ask you, Job, can ye explain these things? And hitherto shalt thou come, I command, and no further. And here shall thy proud waves be stayed. Hast thou commanded the morning since you came to the earth? What does that mean? Well, we all know how and when the morning comes. The morning comes because the earth rotates around the sun. And on its axis, it rotates circularly. And as the earth comes around to where the sun can see its face, we say the morning has arrived. Job, I got a question for you. I commanded the morning. I am the one who said, let there be light. And there was light. Can you join me in a discussion of that principle, and let's sit down and have a discussion on these things? Has it gotten to you yet thus far that there's not much of a debate going on here? Can you see that Job was so far outnumbered, his wisdom was so without understanding, what God had done was so far beyond, and then he's saying to Job, Job, come on, son. Now you're asking me if I had the wisdom to do what I have done with you, and you're questioning the wisdom that I have. Command the morning to arise. We were in a funeral here one day, and I told this Pentecostal helpless preacher, don't try to do your miracle stuff and all that, because if you do, I'll get up and embarrass you, because you're not going to do that in this building. But he got up and he went on his miracle parade and all that. So it was about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I said, sir, if you have the authority to countermand the God of heaven, if you have an ability to stop what he has commanded and set in place, it is now 2:30. I want you to cause the sun to go back like it stood when it was 12 o'clock. And if you can't cause the day to change, or the time to change in the day, or the place that the sun is in the heavens, just on that small a scale, don't you try to tell me that a man does not have to be baptized in order to be saved, which was his claim. Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the day spring to know his place? Now the day spring is when the light comes forth. All of us talk about the beauty of the sunrise and the glory of the sunset. Job, do you understand how that all comes about? Do you understand why that this works this way? Job, can you discuss these things with me? Of course, we know that these things could not have been. God reasons with someone who cannot understand, even how he laid the foundations of the earth. And why do we have a right to ask God about anything in greater depth than that? Oh, there's a time to live and there's a time to die. But there's a lot of people that question this time. When the measurements of the earth were determined and creation was brought about in an orderly, mathematical, measured, if you will please, predetermined, governed law by the will of God. Have we ever determined how much the planet Earth weighs yet? Well, to hang something in space, don't you have to have some way fixed by law and mathematics to cause that to be stable? They all tickle me when they talk about the earth and this global warming and all this junk that these people come up with. My friend, when you're contesting the wisdom of Almighty God and the work of His hand, and you can't even tell how He keeps the earth setting stable, and then neither can they explain how that the rain began to be at the time of the flood and why. And because of this, they question the providence of God. And sometimes we as members of the church get into that position. If it's not rained enough, and some of the brethren have some crops in the field that are being destroyed, and in some other place, the brethren have too much rain, which are being thwarted in growth by too much water. And some of us have the unmitigated gall to question the God of heaven who created all of these laws and put them perfectly into existence. Which God is described that set the line in the sand? Which God? So you see what Job has done, because of his anxiety and his pain and his misfortune, has misunderstood the wisdom of God. And because he has questioned the wisdom of God, God enters into a discussion with Job that we'll find out later on. Job would have given about anything that he had to get out of that debate, because he was so far over his head he couldn't even begin to comprehend what God was asking him and what he was going to try to do to reason to answer. And he had gotten into himself in a position that he'd come up with some things because of his ignorance and his arrogance that he guessed at and didn't understand. Because not only could he not explain the stability of the earth, he didn't understand who the cornerstone was going to be. And from our vantage point, we need to appreciate the fact that the God of heaven, by the existence and power of the witnesses that were there when he created the heavens and the earth, has not needed to call upon them to exercise any testimony concerning those events, because the Almighty has stated it, and by stating it made it a fact. And no one who has any wisdom at all can restrain what God has done. Job, you're the one that picked the fight. You're the one that came up with questions. You're the one that's questioned me. Job, well, you don't even understand my moral law. You don't comprehend my mortal judgment. You're not even able to discuss. Well, you can't even begin a discussion with me, Job. What am I going to do? The place of birth from whence God began this heaven and this earth is so far beyond our comprehension and ability to comprehend. There is no way for us to question God. Now, I think a lot of times we need to go back and to study these things, and if you will, and you'll come on Sunday nights while I have the opportunity to preach these things, we'll go through a lot more of these questions. And we'll ask and see the position that man is in relation to God. And see that not only don't we have the right, we've not been invited to the assembly in which these questions were decided long before the creation of the heaven and the earth became a reality. And then we can understand that the ones who were invited to that great assembly pre-existed, were not a part of time, and were not governed by law, and had no consciousness of an inability of any means. But they who came to the council of the Almighty and came to the place where God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit came together in what is called the council of eternity, has not invited man into this realm to discuss these things. Job, you sure you want to talk about this? Let's qualify you first. And what we've done tonight is begin to qualify Job just a little bit. And we found out that he immeasurably does not qualify, and inconceivably cannot even discuss the things that we have assumed and had taken for granted. By the way, have you ever made a planet? Have you ever hung it on nothing? Have you ever made it rotate around the sun? Do you now, because you've had a chance to study, know when the morning and the evening comes? And before you understood the laws of math and weight and science, were you able and could you discuss these things with He who made them? We find ourselves just glad to be invited to the, as Bobby was going to read tonight, the inaugural party. Otherwise, we couldn't begin to understand what's going on. If you're here tonight and need to respond to the invitation, the plan of God is still true. And we are just as helpless as Job or anybody else who questions the counsel of God. So if God says thou shalt not, instead of you questioning God because you think you're smarter than He, maybe you better stop and figure out just who you're dealing with. And know that He has given you His wisdom, which is beyond your ability to comprehend. Will you come as we stand and sing?
God, we